All right, welcome to Changing the Stigma. I am your host, James Cline. This show is about mental health, changing the stigma behind mental health. I know in previous shows I talk about veterans. You can see I'm wearing a U.S. Army shirt. So kind of my background when it gets into mental health and just me in general. In the past, at the ripe age of 19, I went into the Marine Corps, had some good duties working for the President in D.C., went to Cuba, got out, worked a few jobs. That was including being a police officer in the state. Got a lot of good experiences with that. And I see a lot of police officers these days are having a lot more to deal with mental health. They're getting a lot of training. I would love to send out a big prop and thank you to the Nashua Police Department. They actually have gone out and sent some of their officers to become trainers for mental health first aid, which is a program that trains those people that aren't in mental health, like civilians, police departments, and other organizations, on how to recognize the signs and symptoms of somebody that might be going through mental health. So a couple of their officers have been trained in that, and their entire police force has been trained in mental health first aid. So if they get onto the scene and they find out that somebody might be struggling with a mental health issue, a common one is people might have a difficulty processing or expressing what might be going on, what they're going through. These officers are able to distinguish that they might be struggling with a mental health issue instead of just being belligerent and not responding to whatever their commands or questions might be. So again, big props out to Nashua Police Department. They're very proactive when it comes out to mental health. They have to deal with a lot of mental health issues here in the Gate City, with a lot of people crossing the border from Massachusetts. It's a growing population. And again, they're doing everything they can to train their officers and be educated in the community when these things come up. So also on top of being a police officer in this state and being in the Marine Corps, I was also in the Army. I was struggling working with, in the civilian world, finding a decent paying job, even with some of my degrees. So I end up re-enlisting because a big part of me missed that camaraderie. So I actually had a 12-year break in service between the Marine Corps and going into the Army. I loved being in the Army, had great experiences between being a recruiter and working with people in the state of Maine, and also deploying out with a unit from the state of Maine on a combat mission overseas. On top of it, by getting back, I've talked about it on some previous episodes with Andrew Reed from HVRP, and also with Mel Moran, a alderman here in the city of Nashua and a state rep, talking about that stigma that's behind mental health and how I got involved in human services. So I ended up taking a job in human services to collect a paycheck until I found something else. I really loved it. My first job was actually in the state of Maine, working as what you would call a live-in manager in a residential program. So this was in the state of Maine. I had a couple brothers. They constantly had reportable incidents back to the state. They had high ratios of staff to them to make sure they got the services they need, along with medications and therapies. Both the brothers were on parole and probation for different crimes. A lot of it was behavior related. So the first challenge was to kind of lay down the ground rules with them, and they laid down the ground rules with me. Once that happened, it was a great experience. And over the 2 years that I was there, I saw how well they grew and how they became successful parts of the community. And all it really takes is a caring adult, a caring individual to sit down and listen and follow through on what they're going to say they're going to do with those folks that might have developmental disabilities and or even co-occurring with a mental health issue too. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between those two. Besides working in Maine in human services, where I got my start, I then transferred down to Massachusetts, worked for one of the largest human service organizations in all of New England. Again, had great experience. I worked right in the city of Boston, in the heart of it, in Roxbury. Great experience going over to Washington Park, hanging out with other individuals, helping support the individuals that were in that program. Eventually, I transferred from Roxbury up to Andover, Mass., where I saw what's called a MIMI program. That stands for medically ill, mentally ill. A lot of those folks came from Tewksbury State Hospital. What happens in that program is It's a little bit different from a regular residential. These folks have a mental health issue that's struggling to either take their medications or go to therapy, whatever might be the treatment plan. So what they want to do is get them into the MIMI program because they have a serious medical issue that's going on. You could have terminal cancer, you could have diabetes that you're struggling to control because your mental health issues, whatever it might be. So there's only 6 in the state at the time when I was there, and the agency I worked for had 4, and I never saw the one that was in Andover. Again, great experience, gave me even more insight into how medical professionals are trained or not trained when it comes to dealing with mental health issues. Because all the staff I had at that MIMI program, they were all CNAs, LPNs, and RNs. That was the staff. Whereas in other residential programs, you had direct support personnel that were specifically trained just for mental health issues and not cross-trained or certified in the medical field. So again, great experience. But what I really was missing was what had happened to me, what had happened to fellow soldiers when we came back, and constant stories that I heard, even my own brother, struggling with mental health issues, struggling with substance use, didn't know where to turn, were prideful for not coming back. So I really want to get involved with veterans and start working with them. And I did find an opportunity up here in Nashua with the agency I work for now, working on a SAMHSA grant, working with homeless veterans. Worked as a case manager, got to meet all kinds of good individuals through that program, but I saw the underlying issue where a lot of them really struggled with mental health and substance use, and that led to the circumstances they were in. So I ended up moving around to other programs up to the point now where I'm back working with homeless veterans in a transitional residential program, and I see all kinds of different things. People are struggling with the substance use, whether it be meth or marijuana or alcohol, which is the most prevalent one, along with mental health issues. Some individuals might be self-medicating through the alcohol or the other substances they're using. Maybe they're overusing the prescriptions they have. Maybe they're not taking the prescriptions. Maybe they're struggling with raising their hand and saying, hey, I do have a problem. And that is part of what this program is really about, is showing that there is a stigma and that we need to change that stigma behind mental health. So all these individuals, not just the veterans, but also when we go out and do outreach and we find those individuals that are homeless, some of them have mental health issues, some of them don't. And that's really stopping, listening to this story, being non-judgmental, and not giving them your advice. What you want to do is you want to give them assurance that there's hope to get through whatever they're going to, give them information about resources that they can utilize, and at some point, connect them with professionals if they do need help with substance use or mental health. Because sometimes these folks end up homeless because they were in subsidized housing or they're in a different kind of housing situation. Maybe they own their home and they started spending their money, their mortgage money, on substances such as meth or heroin or cocaine or even alcohol, and they didn't pay their mortgage, didn't pay their rent, and they end up on the street. So that's the part of changing the stigma that we want to do. We want to make sure we change that. I said it on last week's episode that stigma literally means dishonor or disgrace. What we need to do is have what Mel Moran said on our first episode, is that we need to have parity when it comes to mental health and your physical health. Because mental health is a medical condition, it affects the way your brain works, and that's an organ. So we need to treat it just like it's a medical condition like anything else, whether it be cancer, cerebral palsy, MS, diabetes, or even just a cold, or even like we know with COVID-19. We need to treat it like it's a medical condition, and we need to make sure the medical field and the mental health field cross over. And that's what they talk about with the informed care, and they also integrated care, where everyone talks to each other as a team. That way people feel more comfortable coming forward to ask for that help. Don't know why it's such a disgraceful thing. You would think that someone with mental health was treated like they had scarlet fever or it was the Black Plague. We are getting more educated, but we need to do more to change that stigma. So all these individuals come forward and able to raise their hands and know that there's hope to get through whatever they're going through. It could be something whether it's depression, anxiety, maybe they do suffer from PTSD, and there's ways for them to get treatment, medications, combination of, to help get through that and be successful back out in our community. And we have a great community. It's growing. We have a lot of good things going on. We have the Art Center coming up. There's all kinds of things that we have here. Even just Mine Falls. That's a great place to go out there and relax, talk to other individuals. I've never seen a mean person out there in Mine Falls. Everybody's very respectful. Everyone likes to stop and talk, ask questions. I'm kind of curious if they were to do that, if someone was walking around and they felt that person had some kind of mental health issue like schizophrenia. Kind of curious if those same people would still talk, just like I have on other episodes, questioned whether or not you would stop somebody if they had a broken arm, or if you would stop to help somebody with a mental health issue. Maybe they're just emotional. Why is it okay when you find somebody, an adult that's emotional, you're afraid you're going to get hurt, but you're okay going up to a child that's emotional to comfort them? It should be the same thing. Emotions are the same no matter what age you are. It's just how they're perceived when you have those emotions. Same thing when it comes to men. Men aren't supposed to cry and not be emotional. Well, you have to be sometimes. You really have to come forward, ask for that help. Sometimes just venting to another person, whether or not they're a licensed person, whether or not they're a professional, they're a friend, whatever, a family member. Sometimes just vetting for whatever you're going through is going to help you out when it comes to your mental health. And again, changing that stigma behind mental health so you feel comfortable doing that. So what are some ways that we can change the stigma? So some of the ways we can actually go through and start changing the stigma behind mental health is we need to make sure that when someone around us is acting differently, we see those signs and those symptoms. So signs are stuff that we can see, that we can observe, that it might be different. Symptoms are things that they're going to explain to us that they might be going through. They might explain that they do feel depressed. They don't feel like getting out of bed. They don't feel like following through. They don't feel like going to work. Maybe they just don't care. They feel there's no reason to keep going. And there is a difference. There's a difference between existing and there's a difference between living. Sometimes people are just existing where if you exist, you should be trying to live. Get out there. See what the world has to explore. Almost every weekend I go out and do something and I find something new that I didn't know about. I just recently went out with my youngest daughter, Isabella. We went out on a whale watching cruise out in Casco Bay in Portland. I've lived in Portland a good portion of my life. I graduated high school there. Didn't even realize that this was something, an option to even do out of Casco Bay. So it's just learning what's out there, finding those resources. And I hope with this show and people being able to come forward and openly talk about mental health, that we can start talking about the things that people can do to get through this. Recreational therapy is a huge thing when it comes to mental health. So someone might be suffering from anxiety or depression, and maybe they just need the prompting to come put a plan together and get out there and find something to do. And in the mental health field, it's what's called coping skills. Really, all a coping skill is something that you can do when you're struggling. So if you're feeling really depressed and you don't feel like getting out of bed or eating, you can look at your, what they call a self-care plan or an action plan, and you can look at it and kind of see what you could do or you've done in the past to help you through. Maybe it is just sitting down reading a book. Maybe it is going for a walk and getting some fresh air. I know some people are more apt to get what they call emotional support animals now, because now, especially a dog, they have to take it outside or have to care for it. Maybe you're feeling down and the cat jumps in your laps and you just kind of pet it and that makes you feel better. Maybe it's taking a hot bath. It could be any of these things. Maybe it's going fishing out here in the canal. Because if you go out here in the canal in Mine Falls, guarantee you're going to catch a bunch of fish. Whole bunch of sunfish out there. Pretty much any time you throw your hook out there with a worm or something on it, you're going to get at least a sunfish. Go in the river, get some bass. There's all kinds of opportunities for you to get things done and go out and do some recreational activities. I've talked about before where I've changed my recreation activities to kind of fit where I am in my life right now. And that's talking with other people and sharing shared experiences. By doing that, you can figure out what you might be able to do. I used to be a football player, semi-pro football, lifted a lot of weights. Now I don't do that stuff anymore. I don't have the need to lift heavy weights. I'm not overseas wearing heavy equipment, carrying around heavy guns. I don't need to be lifting 500, 600, 700 pounds. Now I've shifted. I can now swim, and I've actually increased it where I could only do 1 or 2 laps at the pool at the Y before I had to stop and take a break. Now I can get in the pool and swim for almost an hour without stopping. And that's just going and taking the small steps and building upon it. I got into cycling. Never thought I would know about cycling. I was actually joking with one of my Army buddies this past weekend. I went to breakfast with him, and the next morning we went out on a nice little ride. Wish I would have known about all the benefits of cycling. And it's not just getting the physical activity. It's just not the fresh air. It's the camaraderie. It's doing something. You are burning calories. But the other thing is you see things in a completely different perspective sometimes when you kind of slow things down or do something differently. Just like on this show, here in the studio it's recording. We might shoot it from one angle or you might shoot it from a different angle so you get a different perspective on what's going on. And if you do, like at the radio station, if I'm doing the radio show, I can sit there and just look at the mic, look at my paperwork, just keep on there talking. But to kind of change things up, I'm constantly looking out the windows, kind of see what's going on out in the community, what's going on in Main Street, what might be happening in the construction at the art center. So there's all kinds of things you can do to change that perspective. And that's what we have to do with the mental health. We need to change our perspective so we can change that stigma that's attached to mental health. We have to have people come forward and feel comfortable with it. One of the worst things that happens out of the stigma that's attached to mental health is actually the self-stigma that individuals have for themselves. That's why they don't come forward. They feel like they're weak. They feel like people are going to look at them differently. They're going to be treated differently. And unfortunately, a lot of those things are still true. And a couple weeks ago, I posed a question. What if you were asked to call out of work? Would you say it was a medical issue, or would you say that it was a mental health issue? Almost everyone I've talked to always says a medical issue because that's where they feel comfortable. So why are you not looked upon weak if you're sick? Why are you not looked upon weak if something happened to you? Why are you not looked upon like you're different? It happened when we weren't educated years ago. If someone got sick, people would keep a wide berth. We kind of did the same thing recently with COVID. Until people got educated on what COVID was, people would walk a mile away from somebody that might have COVID. And that's still happening with mental health. So I can't believe that this is still happening in today, but it is happening. So some of the ways we can help do that is, one, is that we need to open the conversation. We need to change that stigma and make sure we are openly talking, just like anybody else would casually. I've had recent conversations with people that have been diagnosed with cancer. Maybe they're struggling with their diabetes and their blood sugar. They have no problem coming forward and telling you their whole life story when it comes to all their medical issues. They'll even tell you about medications, how often they're taking it, what doctor they're seeing, what specialist they're seeing. But what doesn't happen is with the mental health, how many people have come forward and tell you that they're seeing a psychiatrist, they're seeing a therapist, that they're seeing a licensed independent clinical social worker, what meds they're taking? Most people are not going to discuss that with you. Even with the individuals that I work with, sometimes it's very hard for them to disclose the mental health stuff they're struggling with when I know that they are struggling with mental health, but they got no problem talking about all the medical stuff they're going to. Don't know where this came from, don't know why it's acceptable. The only reference I can have to kind of relate to it is like illicit drugs. You have illicit drugs that are non-prescribed, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, all those illicit drugs. Well, another drug out there that's widely accepted, marijuana is kind of getting that push right now to be widely accepted across the country. But one that already is, and it is a drug, is alcohol. But nobody has a problem telling you how many drinks they had. But you get treated differently if you talk about how many hits of heroin you just did. They're both drugs, they're both addictive, but we've allowed the alcohol to be widely accepted whereas the other drugs are not. And some of those drugs could be useful for individuals if being given and taken by prescription in different forms, maybe by a doctor, psychiatrist. And a lot of those illicit drugs, they already are in prescription drugs, just in smaller quantities or in a different formulation. So we're already using those things. So my question is, why is alcohol acceptable, the other drugs aren't? And it's kind of the same way as mental health. Mental health is not acceptable, but severe medical issues, people want to talk about it, how they can help you. And what we need to do is we need to be empathetic when people have mental health issues. And that's the difference. You don't want to be sympathetic, you want to be empathetic. And I do see when people start talking about their medical issues, a lot of people become very sympathetic to them. And what we really should be doing, whether it's a medical condition, a physical condition, or a mental health condition, we want to be empathetic. You want to be able to put yourself in their shoes and try to see it from their perspective. When you're sympathetic, you're going to start turning people off. You're not going to be able to help them as much as it is. And you're really judging them when you become sympathetic. So that's a way we can start changing the stigma behind it, is being empathetic. We want to be non-judgmental, and we want to make sure that we are able to have that open conversation. I can't wait for the day when I'm walking down the street and I actually hear people talking about how they got depressed a few weeks ago. They raised their hand almost immediately, and they started talking about their mental health issues. And they were able to get some help. The sooner you're able to come forward and talk about your mental health and get it addressed, the much quicker and easier it's probably going to be for you to overcome those. Whereas if you wait and wait and wait, where the average person can wait up to 10 years to come forward. I know when I was struggling coming back from Afghanistan, it took me almost, I think it was like 6 years before I went to the VA to even put in for services. And then it took another 2 years for me to follow through on it because I kept on coming with roadblocks. And I threw my hands up and I said, fine, I'm just not going to do this because there's always another barrier and I don't want to have to overcome it. So it took me almost 8 years to come forward and get the services I needed through the VA. And now it's my turn to give back in a show like this, on the radio show, which is every Friday on WSMN, 1590 AM and 95.3 FM. That's Fridays from 11 to 12 p.m. Listen in. We talk about a lot of the same things we talk about here on the TV show. And I really want to make sure we're out there changing what we're talking about, getting that conversation started. We want to make sure we change the stigma behind this. We don't need to degrade those people out there. And another food for thought I want to talk about is person-centered language. We want to make sure, in order for people to come forward and talk about the stigma that's attached to the mental health and make them feel comfortable, is we want to make sure that we talk about them as a person. So if you're talking about John that has a disability because he has PTSD and he's struggling with his day-to-day activities, you should be saying his name or however he wants to be addressed and talk about that he might have a disability. You don't want to say, that's disabled John over there. Same thing, another example for person-centered is, let's say somebody has a physical handicap. We want to make sure we're using the right verbiage. We want to make sure that we don't call it a handicap bathroom. It's a bathroom that's accessible. We want to leave out the handicap part because, again, there's a stigma attached to that. And we definitely want to make sure that we can change that. Even in the field when I am in mental health, if you look at my documentations, I always call the person by their name or as an individual if I have to leave their name out of what documents I'm doing. I always refer to them as a person or an individual. I never refer to them as a client or as a patient. That's really demeaning who they are. They are a real person, they are unique, they are important to the community. In whatever the situation that I'm typing up or writing up that needs to be written up, I want to show that they are important and that they really are a real person. Because client and patient, that's just a generic name. In working down in Massachusetts, that's how we always did our documentation. We always called the person an individual or by their name if it was appropriate. We never referred to them as a Cline patient. So that's some stuff to keep in mind. Another thing is that we want to make sure those folks with a mental health issue, that there is hope to get through it and that they are not a victim of their mental health. You want to give them hope that they can survive through it and that they will be considered a survivor of getting through their mental health. We want to make sure they understand that there is hope and there is a way through it. There's plenty of trainings out there. On my next episode, I will talk about mental health first aid. There are 3 different versions. There's ones for adults, there's ones for teen, and there's also one for youth, where that's actually designed for adults that work with youth. Because a lot of the youth and teens are struggling with this. It's a training where they give you an action plan called ALGE. It's how you approach, how you listen, give reassurance, and then you encourage them multiple times with professional help and resources. Next episode, I'll get a little bit more into mental health first aid, how you can look up for those trainings. These are very important out there for all of us to get through. We should all take a class because the World Health Organization talks about 1 in 5 people in the entire world, that's almost 70 million Americans and almost 1 billion people in the world, suffer at some point in their life with mental health. And we want to make sure these people come forward, that they don't take their own lives, that they don't hurt themselves, they don't hurt others, and they come forward and become another part of that society. That we are talking, that we are changing mental health to make sure that people know that there's no stigma attached to it and they can freely talk to whoever they want about it. And it's also you out there is learning those resources, 988, the Rapid Response Access Point, and all the other resources that we have out here in this community. I appreciate you listening to watching Changing the Stigma, and thank you.